I have built bridges that carry thousands of people safely across distances they couldn't cross alone. I have never, not once in 68 years, asked anyone to carry me. So when I came out of surgery with a drainage tube in my side and the surgeon's voice still echoing in my head, and I called my daughter and asked, for the first time in my life, if I could stay with her for a few weeks while I recovered, I believed that was the hardest thing I would have to do. I was wrong. The hardest thing was standing in her hallway 2 days later, still in the clothes I'd been discharged in, my surgical bag in one hand, hearing my son-in-law's voice travel through the wall of their kitchen like a blade. This isn't a nursing home. Welcome back to your ultimate destination for gripping revenge stories, family betrayals, shocking betrayals, and emotional justice. Subscribe now and join a community and tell us where you're watching from. Turn on the notification bell for our next story. Are you ready to witness the ultimate payback? Let's get started. I am Mr. ZAHA, and I am 68 years old. Before I tell you what happened in that hallway, I need to tell you who I was before the hallway. Because the man who stood there with a surgical bag and a drainage tube, and those words entering him like something cold, that man had a whole life before that moment, and the life matters. The life is the reason those words landed where they landed and did what they did. I grew up in Western North Carolina, in a town small enough that everybody knew your business and large enough that you could still find privacy if you knew where to look. My father was a carpenter, not a contractor, not a developer, a carpenter. A man who made things with his hands and who believed, with the quiet certainty of someone who has never needed anyone to tell him what to believe, that a man's worth was measured in what he built and what he endured. He was not cruel. He was not cold exactly. He was simply formed by a world that had not offered him softness and had therefore not taught him to offer it. I became a structural engineer. I took my father's relationship with materials, with the behavior of things under load, with the question of what holds and what gives, and I translated it into a career. 31 years with an engineering firm in Asheville, then 11 more as a consultant, designing bridges and overpasses and load-bearing structures across the Southeast. I understood, at a cellular level, how things were built to last, how you calculated the margin between what a structure could bear and what would break it. I understood it in buildings. I was slower to understand it in people. My wife, Caroline, had been the person who taught me that people had load limits too. Caroline was from Georgia, a woman of extraordinary warmth and equally extraordinary patience, both of which she deployed, across 34 years of marriage, in the project of softening the edges of a man who had been built without many of them. She laughed easily and loved fiercely and had the remarkable gift of making everyone in her orbit feel simultaneously seen and comfortable, which is a rarer combination than most people realize. We had 2 daughters. Priscilla, the older, born when I was 29, a girl who arrived looking so completely like Caroline that I used to stare at her in the crib, convinced I was experiencing some kind of benevolent trick. And Renata, the younger, born 3 years later, who got my stubbornness and her mother's warmth and became, in the combination, a force of nature that her high school teachers remember to this day. Caroline died 6 years ago. Breast cancer, 3 years from diagnosis to the end. 3 years of fighting with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. 3 years that changed all 4 of us. Me, Priscilla, Renata, in ways both visible and interior. She left us in October, on a morning when the mountains around Asheville were doing their autumnal best, as though the world was performing beauty in compensation for what it was taking away. After Caroline died, I did what I had always done. I kept moving. I stayed in the Asheville house. I maintained my consulting practice at reduced hours. I saw my daughters on holidays and called them on weekends and walked 4 miles every morning because the cardiologist had been asking me to for years, and grief had finally given me the motivation that good sense had failed to produce. I was, by most visible measures, managing. What I was managing less visibly was the particular physical deterioration that accumulates when a man spends several years not sleeping well, not eating particularly carefully, and carrying a grief load that he is too proud to discuss with anyone who might help him carry it. My blood pressure, which had been borderline for a decade, became less borderline. A stress test the previous March had produced a conversation with my cardiologist that I had not fully conveyed to my daughters. And in January of this year, during a routine follow-up that turned out to be less routine than advertised, A scan had revealed something that required surgery. The something was a growth on my left kidney. Not the worst version of the diagnosis. My urologist, Dr. Hendricks, was careful and thorough in his reassurance, but requiring surgical removal, a partial nephrectomy, inpatient procedure, general anesthesia, a recovery period of 4 to 6 weeks during which I would be restricted in ways that my independent, 4 miles a morning life was not designed to accommodate. I told my daughters the week after the diagnosis. I had waited a week not to protect them, but because I needed the week to organize my own response to it before I could present it to anyone else. This is the kind of thing I would later, with the clarity that difficult experiences produce, recognize as a pattern, the instinct to process privately, to arrive at conversations already prepared, to offer information rather than need, to be the structure rather than the thing requiring support. Priscilla cried on the phone. She is 38 years old, and she cried the way she had cried at her mother's funeral, quietly, with control, the tears of physical fact rather than a performance. She asked the right questions in the right order. What kind of surgery? What were the outcomes? What did the recovery involve? What did I need? That last question, what do you need, Daddy, was the one I was not prepared for. Because I had spent 68 years knowing exactly what I needed and acquiring it through my own effort, and the surgery had introduced, for the first time, a category of need that my own effort could not address. I needed someone to stay with for the recovery period. The surgical team was explicit. I could not be alone for the first 3 weeks minimum. The drainage tube required monitoring. There were activity restrictions that made living alone in a 3-story house genuinely dangerous. I needed, for a defined and temporary period, to be in someone else's care. I had thought about this before I called Priscilla. I had considered a rehabilitation facility. Dr. Hendricks had mentioned them, briefly, as an option. I had researched them with the thoroughness of an engineer evaluating materials. They were fine. They were professional and adequate and entirely impersonal. And the thought of spending my recovery in one of them, in a room that had held 100 other recoveries and would hold 100 more, surrounded by staff who were competent but not mine, that thought sat in my chest like a load calculation I couldn't make work. I had one other option. Renata, my younger daughter, lived in Denver. The distance made logistics complicated. I would need to fly post-surgery, which the surgical team advised against for at least 2 weeks. Priscilla lived 40 minutes from Asheville, in Hendersonville, North Carolina, in a house I had visited for holidays and birthdays and the ordinary occasions of a family life, a house with a guest room on the ground floor and a daughter who had asked, on the phone, what I needed. I called her back the next day and I asked. I said it simply, because I had rehearsed simpler versions of it until I found the one I could actually produce. Priscilla, I would like to stay with you for the recovery period, if that works for you and Joshua. 4 to 6 weeks. I'll manage everything I can myself, and I won't be more of a burden than I have to be. There was a silence on the other end that I registered but did not analyze deeply enough. Then Priscilla said, "Of course, Daddy. Of course you'll stay with us." Her voice was warm. Her voice was, in every audible way, exactly what you would want a daughter's voice to sound like when her father asks for help. What I did not hear, could not have heard through a phone, would not have known to listen for, was what was happening in the room around her. Whether Joshua was in the kitchen when she said it, whether he had been consulted, whether her of course was the answer of a woman making a free choice or the answer of a woman who had already committed and would handle the consequences later. I had the surgery 11 days later. Dr. Hendricks and his team were excellent. I was in the hospital for 3 days, during which Priscilla visited every afternoon and sat with me in the way that daughters sit with fathers in hospitals, attentively, with the particular alertness of someone monitoring both the patient and the room, noting what the nurses did and when, asking the right questions of the right people. On the 3rd day I was discharged. Priscilla drove me to her house in Hendersonville. I remember the drive, the February mountains, the bare trees, and the low winter sky. Priscilla with both hands on the wheel, navigating carefully on the curves, the way she'd always driven, deliberately, with attention. Me in the passenger seat, the surgical bag beside me, the drainage tube under my shirt, feeling for the first time in 68 years the specific vulnerability of a body that has been opened and closed, and is now in the process of remembering itself. We pulled into the driveway of the house in Hendersonville. Priscilla helped me out of the car with the careful efficiency of a woman who had prepared for this, who had thought about the logistics in advance, who had her mother's gift for anticipating what was needed. We went inside. Joshua was in the kitchen. I heard him before I saw him. Or rather, I heard what he was saying before the sound resolved into words, heard the shape of it from the entryway before Priscilla and I had cleared the hallway. A voice, low and tense, directed at a phone he was holding to his ear, words arriving to me in fragments as I moved slowly down the hallway, the fragments assembling themselves, with the cold efficiency of an engineer processing structural data, into a sentence I was not meant to hear. This isn't a nursing home. I stopped in the hallway. Priscilla, one step ahead of me, stopped too. Her hand, which had been lightly on my arm to steady me, went still. We stood in the hallway of her house, she and I, and we listened to her husband's voice on the other side of the kitchen wall, and the surgery I had just recovered from was nothing, compared to what those 4 words did. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Mr. ZAHA standing in that hallway? What would you have said? I want to describe what happened in my body when I heard those words, because it is important to understand that this was not simply an emotional experience. It was physical. Something happened in my chest, not cardiac, not the kind that requires emergency response, but something that I can only describe as a structural shift. The way a load-bearing element responds when the load it was designed to carry is suddenly redistributed to a point it was not designed to bear. My hand found the hallway wall. Not dramatically, just the automatic response of a body that has been through surgery 4 days ago and has suddenly received information that the nervous system processes as threat. My fingertips on the cool, painted drywall of my daughter's hallway. Priscilla turned to look at me. I have known my daughter for 38 years. I know her face the way you know the faces of the people you have watched grow from infant to adult. Not just the features, but the language underneath them. The micro-expressions that precede and follow the managed surface. What I saw in her face in that hallway was not surprise. That is what I keep returning to. It was not surprise. It was the expression of a person who has been dreading an inevitability and has now watched it arrive. She knew. Not the specific words, perhaps, but she knew there was a problem. She had known before she brought me into this house. That knowledge, the knowledge that she had known, landed separately from the original wound. 2 things hitting in quick succession, the way structural failures often occur. A primary event, and then the secondary event that the primary makes possible. Joshua's voice from the kitchen continued. I was hearing one side of a phone call. Someone was on the other end, receiving his compressed, pressured commentary. I told her this was going to be an issue. 4 to 6 weeks, Brent. In my house. And he can't do anything for himself right now. The guy just had surgery. Priscilla moved, quick and quiet, into the kitchen, and I heard her voice intercept his, low and urgent. Joshua. Stop. A brief silence. Then Joshua's voice, different register now, aware. I'll call you back. The sound of a phone being set down. I stood in the hallway for a moment longer. Then I moved to the entrance of the kitchen. Joshua Webb was 42 years old, 6 feet even, with the build of a man who had played college sports and maintained it afterward with the kind of disciplined gym commitment that speaks to a relationship with control. He was a financial analyst, successful, precise, a man who ran his household the way he ran his spreadsheets, with careful attention to inputs and outputs. He was not, by any standard, a cruel person. I want to be accurate about that because accuracy matters to me more than narrative simplicity. He was not cruel. He was a man who had preferences about his space and his routine and who had, it was now apparent, not been fully consulted before his wife committed that space to her surgical father for 4 to 6 weeks. He saw me in the kitchen doorway. What happened in his face was a sequence I watched with the detachment that shock sometimes produces, the recognition, the calculation, the attempt at recovery, the failure of the attempt because there is no version of this that the recovery covers adequately. Mr. ZAHA, he said. I didn't hear you come in. I know, I said. The kitchen was very quiet. Priscilla stood between us with the posture of a woman occupying the space between 2 forces she loves and cannot fully reconcile, and I saw in her body the exhaustion of that position. Saw it the way I had not seen things in my daughter before, perhaps because I had not been looking carefully enough. I think, I said, slowly, because the drainage tube under my shirt was a physical reminder that I was not in a condition to sustain a long, heated exchange, that you and I need to speak plainly to each other. Joshua looked at his wife. Priscilla looked at her father. I looked at the kitchen table and moved toward a chair and sat down, because standing was still effortful, and I had decided that whatever came next, I would face it sitting down with my back straight and my voice level. I sat at their kitchen table and I looked at Joshua Webb and I said, "Tell me what you actually feel about this arrangement." He was not prepared for the directness. I watched him recalibrate. "Mr. ZAHA, what you heard." "I heard what I heard," I said. "I'm not angry about it. I am asking you to say it to my face, plainly, so that we are all operating with accurate information." Priscilla sat down. She put her hands flat on the table, and I recognized the gesture. It was Caroline's gesture, the one she made when she was preparing to hold something steady. Joshua sat down across from me. He looked, for a moment, like a man who had practiced composure for so long that being asked to set it down was physically disorienting. Then something shifted in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but a kind of reluctant honesty. "I have concerns," he said, "about the length of the arrangement, about what it means for the household routine, about," he stopped, chose his next words with visible care, "about what the expectation is going to be, whether 4 to 6 weeks becomes longer, whether this becomes a nursing home," I said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "You said that word," I said, "not me. And I want you to understand something about that word and what it did when it came through that wall." I paused. I am 68 years old. I have never, in 68 years of living, asked anyone for help the way I asked to come here. I have built things that carry thousands of people safely. I have buried my wife alone because I didn't want to impose my grief on my daughters. I have maintained my house, my practice, my life, without asking my children to manage any of it. I stopped, looked at him steadily. When I called Priscilla and asked to come here, it was the hardest phone call of my adult life. And what I needed to be true when I made that call, was that I was welcome. I paused again. Not accommodated. Not managed. Welcome. The kitchen was very still. "I'm not a burden that arrived without warning," I continued. "I am a man who had surgery and asked his daughter if he could recover in her home, because she is my daughter and I love her, and I did not want to be alone in a facility. That is the entire truth of why I am here." I looked at Joshua. Now I need to know whether I actually am. Joshua looked at his wife. And here is the part that is hardest to write. Priscilla, my daughter, Caroline's daughter, the woman who had cried quietly on the phone when I told her about the diagnosis, was looking at her husband with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not anger, not desperation, something more deeply tired than both of those. The expression of a woman who has been in the middle of something for a long time and has just watched it become unavoidable. "I told you," she said to Joshua. Her voice was quiet and precise. "I told you when Daddy called. I told you what I wanted to do, and I told you I needed you to be in this with me. And you said you were." "I am," Joshua said. "Then what was that phone call to Brent?" Joshua did not answer immediately. "What was that, Joshua?" He pressed his lips together. "I was venting," he said. "I had a rough day and I was saying things I shouldn't have said out loud. My father heard them." "I know. My father, who just had surgery 4 days ago, and who has never asked us for a single thing in the entire time we've been married, heard you call him a nursing home through the wall of our own house." The word, repeated, landed in the room with different weight coming from her. I sat at their table and I watched my daughter hold her husband accountable in real time. And I felt two things simultaneously that I was not prepared to feel simultaneously. The injury of what had been said, still present and still sharp, and something else, something that was almost, not quite, but almost, the beginning of understanding. Not of Joshua, not yet, but of Priscilla, of the position she had been in, quietly, without my knowledge, of the weight she had been carrying between the man she married and the father she loved. She had said, "I told you I needed you to be in this with me." And he had said he was. And then, the moment I arrived, he had called Brent. She had known. She had brought me into the house knowing there was an unresolved tension, because the alternative, telling her surgical father that her husband had reservations, was something she could not do to me 4 days post-operation. She had been protecting me. Again, the way daughters who love their fathers protect them, by standing in the gap and paying the cost of it themselves. I sat at that table and the injury and the understanding existed together in me. And I looked at my daughter and I thought, "Caroline, you gave her your whole heart and your whole courage and she's been spending both of them on the people she loves, and no one has been asking how much it's costing her. Joshua, I said. He looked at me. I'm going to give you and Priscilla some time to talk, I said. I'm going to go to the guest room and rest, because I genuinely need to. I placed my hands on the table and stood, slowly, carefully. But when you've talked, I'd like to have a real conversation. The three of us. About what this arrangement actually looks like. About what you need and what I need and what Priscilla needs, which I suspect is the thing both of us have been least careful about. I paused. I'm not here to be a burden. I'm not here to disrupt your life. And I'm not leaving before my doctor says I can leave. I looked at him steadily. But I'm also not going to pretend I didn't hear what I heard. That is not how I was raised, and it is not how I intend to conduct myself in this house. I left the kitchen. I made it to the guest room. I sat on the edge of the bed, carefully, the drainage bag beside me on the nightstand, and I looked at my hands on my knees and I breathed. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Caroline's instruction. Always. I breathed, and I waited, and through the closed door I heard the low, serious sound of my daughter and her husband beginning the conversation that should have happened before I arrived. Two people in that kitchen both failed Priscilla in different ways. Tell me in the comments, what did you notice? What should have happened differently? I need to hear your thoughts. They talked for 2 hours. I know this because I was in the guest room for 2 hours, not sleeping. I tried, and my body was tired enough to want sleep, but my mind was conducting the kind of systematic inventory that it runs in the aftermath of structural events. Cataloging what I knew, what I didn't know, what I had seen and heard, and what it implied. What I had seen: a son-in-law who had reservations about my presence that he had not fully disclosed to his wife, and a wife who had committed to my coming and had been managing the gap between her commitment and his reservations in the space between. What I didn't know: how long that gap had existed, whether this was new friction or old, whether my surgery had exposed something that was already present in their marriage, a load-bearing tension that had been there before I arrived. What I had seen in Priscilla's face: exhaustion that was not new, the tiredness of a long-running situation, not an acute one. That observation troubled me more than Joshua's phone call. Renata called at 4 o'clock. My younger daughter, calling from Denver with the instinct she had inherited from her mother, the ability to sense, across distance, when something needed attending. How are you feeling? She asked. How's the recovery going? How's the house? Fine, I said. The engineer's reflex. I'm fine. The house is fine. Daddy. Her voice, patient and precise. It's me. I told her some of it. Not all. Not the full shape of the kitchen scene. Not the phrase through the wall. Not the 2 hours of closed-door conversation I could still faintly hear resolving in the other part of the house. But enough. Enough that Renata, who was perceptive enough to fill the space between what I said and what I wasn't saying, went quiet for a moment and then said, "Do you want me to come?" "No," I said. "Not yet. Let me see how the next few days go." "Daddy." "Renata, I'm all right. I'm handling it." A pause. "You don't always have to handle things alone," she said. "That's kind of the whole point of having daughters." I thought about that after I hung up. About the whole point of having daughters and the particular way I had related to that point for 68 years, by being the father who was handled, never the father who was handling. The load-bearing element, not the thing being carried. How thoroughly that identity had shaped me, and how thoroughly the last week had begun, gently, surgically, unavoidably, to dismantle it. Priscilla knocked on the guest room door at 6. She came in quietly and sat in the chair by the window, the one facing the February garden, bare and patient, and she looked at me with the expression I had begun to read more clearly in the past few hours. The careful, managing expression of a woman who was about to tell her father something truthfully. "He wants to apologize," she said. "All right, Daddy, before he does, I need to tell you something." She looked at her hands. "Joshua and I have been going through something. Not a crisis, I don't want you to think, but a difficult period. About the house, about our routines, about space, and about," she paused, "about what we each need and whether we've been giving it to each other." She looked up. "When you called and asked to come, I said yes immediately, because you're my father and you'd just been diagnosed and the answer was obvious to me. But I didn't. I handled the conversation with Joshua badly. I told him rather than asking him. And he agreed, but he agreed without really agreeing. And I knew that, and I brought you here anyway, because I didn't know how to tell you the complication without hurting you. I sat with that. How long has it been difficult? I asked. About a year, she said. And then, as though the admission had opened a door, he works very long hours. When he comes home, he needs the house to be quiet and low demand. I've been accommodating that, mostly. But it's meant that I've been managing a lot. The house, the social calendar, my own work. Doing it quietly so it doesn't create friction. She stopped. I think bringing you here, even though it was the right thing, Daddy, it was absolutely the right thing. I think it also surfaced something that was already under pressure. I looked at my daughter, at the circles under her eyes that I had clocked when she picked me up from the hospital and attributed to concern about me, at the careful, managing quality that I had always read as her mother's organizational competence and was now reading as something more weighted, at the fact that she had been, for approximately a year, doing what she had apparently been doing since childhood, carrying things quietly so the people around her didn't have to feel the weight. Priscilla, I said, how are you? She blinked. The question, the simple, direct version of it, stripped of context and agenda, seemed to reach her somewhere she hadn't been reached in a while. Her expression shifted in the way expressions shift when something unexpected is offered. Tired, she said. And then, as though the single word had been a pin pulled, I'm really tired, Daddy. I reached out and put my hand over hers on the arm of the chair. I did not offer analysis. I did not produce a plan. I just kept my hand over hers and let the silence be what it was, not empty, but full. The way silences between people who love each other can be full. I'm sorry, I said. I should have seen this sooner. I should have been asking you this question for a long time. She shook her head. You didn't know. I should have been paying the kind of attention that meant I would know. She turned her hand over and held mine. And we sat there for a while, my daughter and I, in the February afternoon light, and I thought about Caroline. About how Caroline had always known the interior weather of the people she loved. How she had walked into a room and known immediately who needed what. How I had relied on that gift for 34 years and had not, after she was gone, developed enough of my own version of it. How Priscilla had been standing in the gap of that missing gift without anyone acknowledging the cost. Joshua knocked an hour later. He knocked on the open door of the guest room, which was both a courtesy and, I thought, a deliberate choice. Knocking on an open door rather than a closed one, making the approach visible, reducing the confrontation of it. He came in and sat in the chair Priscilla had vacated. He sat with his elbows on his knees, not the composed, upright Joshua of the kitchen earlier, but a man who had spent 2 hours in a difficult conversation and had arrived at the other end of it with his posture adjusted accordingly. Mr. ZAHA, he said, I owe you an apology, and I'm not going to dress it up. I waited. What you heard through the wall, he stopped. There's no version of that I can explain that makes it better. You were 4 days out of surgery, and I was on the phone characterizing you as a problem in my own house. That was wrong. It was disrespectful, and it was the kind of thing that a man who thinks he's a decent person has to sit with seriously when he gets caught doing it. He looked at me steadily. I've been sitting with it for the last 2 hours. I appreciate that, I said. I want to tell you something honestly, he continued. Because Priscilla said you're a man who operates better with the full truth than with the comfortable version. She's right about that. I have been feeling, he chose the word carefully, overwhelmed. Not specifically by you. By a period in our lives that has been more demanding than I've handled well. And when Priscilla said you were coming, my first feeling was one more thing. Not you specifically. He stopped. Just pressure. And I handled that in the worst possible way, which was to say something that reduced you to a problem category instead of being the man I want to be about it. I looked at Joshua Webb across the guest room of his house, at the man my daughter had married, whom I had evaluated across 7 years of Thanksgivings and Christmases and birthday dinners with the same structural precision I had brought to everything, finding him adequate in some measurements and not in others, never quite arriving at warmth. And I thought about what Priscilla had said about a year of difficulty, about the long hours and the quiet house and the management that had been accumulating. 2 people in a marriage both running at capacity and neither of them saying it to the other. And I had arrived, with my surgical bag and my drainage tube, into the middle of it, not as the cause of it, but as the event that made it impossible to continue managing quietly. Joshua, I said, I'm going to say something to you that I have not been positioned to say in 7 years of being your father-in-law. He waited. I have not made it easy for you to talk to me. I have maintained a distance with you that I told myself was respectful of your marriage, but that I think was also, if I'm being entirely honest, a form of judgment held at a professional remove. I paused. I have measured you against a standard I never articulated, and you have been aware of being measured, and that has made every room we've shared together slightly more effortful than it needed to be. I paused again. I regret that. Not because it excuses what I heard through the wall, but because context matters, and some of the context of what happened today belongs to me. Joshua looked at me for a long moment. I don't know that I've made it easy either, he said. No, I agreed. But I'm older, and I knew better. Something happened in his expression then. Not dramatic, not cinematic. A small shift. The increment of change that occurs when two people arrive, simultaneously, at a shared honesty they had not previously occupied together. Can we start over? He said. We can start from here, I said. Which is not the same as starting over but is, I think, more honest. He considered that. Then he nodded. From here, then, Joshua and Mr. ZAHA, face to face with the truth. Tell me in the comments, was Joshua's apology enough? What do you think needs to happen next for this family to actually heal? 3 days passed. 3 days of the particular texture of a household in negotiated transition. Everyone moving carefully, adjusting their behavior in ways both deliberate and unconscious, the house finding a new equilibrium around its altered composition. Joshua went to work at his usual hour and came home at his usual hour, and when he came home, he did not disappear into the office the way Priscilla had described. He came to the kitchen. He sat at the table. He asked how I was feeling with a specificity that told me the question was not performative. He asked about the drainage tube, about the pain level, about whether Dr. Hendrix's check-in call had gone well. He was making an effort. The effort was visible and imperfect and genuine, which is the most honest kind. Priscilla hovered, not smotheringly, but with the careful attention of a woman who was monitoring two situations simultaneously and managing both with the efficiency that was her nature. She brought me meals at the times the surgical team had specified. She made sure I had what I needed without making the having of it feel like surveillance. She was excellent at this, the particular skill of caring for someone without diminishing them, and I recognized in it the direct inheritance of her mother. But I also noticed what I had not noticed before the guest room conversation. The tiredness underneath the efficiency. The way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window in the mornings with her coffee and her back to the room. And the set of her shoulders in those moments was not the set of a woman who was simply organizing her day. It was the set of a woman who was gathering herself. On the 4th day, I asked her to sit with me. She came to the guest room after breakfast, in the way she had come 2 days before, and this time I did not wait for her to open the conversation. I had spent 4 days recovering and observing and thinking about what needed to be said, and I had arrived at the understanding that the thing requiring the most courage in this house was not the confrontation with Joshua. That had happened. That had produced something real, imperfect and real. The thing requiring the most courage was the conversation I needed to have with my daughter about herself. Priscilla, I said, I want to talk about you. She smiled, the careful managing smile. I'm fine, Daddy. You told me 3 days ago that you were tired, I said. I've been watching you for 3 days since then, and tired is an understatement. The managing smile stayed in place for a moment, and then, slowly, it didn't. Tell me about the year, I said. Not the version where you protect me from the parts that might worry me. The whole year. She looked at her hands. Joshua works 60, sometimes 70 hours a week, she said. He's been chasing a promotion for 18 months, and it's required everything he has professionally, and there's not much left when he comes home. I knew that going in. I knew when he said he was going for this that it would be a hard stretch. I agreed to it. She paused. What I didn't account for was how much space it would leave in the house that I would fill by myself. She looked up. I love my work. I do. I love the school counseling, but it's emotionally demanding in a way that doesn't stop at the end of the day. I come home carrying things. And Joshua comes home carrying things. And we've been very careful with each other about not adding our things to the other person's pile. And what that's produced is, she searched for the word, a very polite loneliness. A very polite loneliness. The phrase arrived and stayed. And then you were diagnosed, she said. And that landed in the middle of all of this. And the fear of losing you, Daddy, after Mama. The fear of losing you was, she stopped. Her voice had found an edge. I couldn't think about logistics or Joshua's feelings or the timing. I just needed you to be here where I could see you and know you were okay. I know, I said. I know. But I handled it wrong, she said. I should have talked to Joshua first. Really talked to him. Not announced it. I was so focused on getting you here safely that I ran over him. And he made that phone call to Brent, and she pressed her lips together. I should have handled it better. Priscilla. I leaned forward. You handled it as a daughter first. That's not wrong. I paused. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to give me a true answer. She waited. Are you happy? I said. In this marriage. On the whole. Are you? The room was very still. She did not answer immediately, which told me something. She looked at the February garden through the window, bare-branched, patient, the kind of quiet that is not absence but dormancy, and she was silent for a long time. I love Joshua, she said finally. I genuinely love him. He is a good man who is going through a hard period and who has not been showing up the way I need him to, and I have not been telling him that clearly enough. Both of those things are true. And the happiness? It's under there, she said. Underneath the tired and the polite loneliness. It's still there. She looked at me. But we need to do some work. Real work. Not just manage the surface. She paused. I think your being here might actually have. As much as the beginning of it was terrible, I think it might have made it impossible for us to keep managing the surface. You arrived, and we had to actually talk. We talked for 2 hours that first day, Joshua and I, in a way that we hadn't talked in months. What did you talk about? She told me. For 40 minutes, she told me. About what had been said in those 2 hours. About what Joshua had admitted to feeling. About what she had admitted in return. About the shape of a marriage that was not broken but was genuinely in need of attention. About the things they had been protecting each other from that they needed instead to share with each other. About Joshua saying, in that kitchen, that he had been so focused on the promotion and the professional pressure that he had stopped asking Priscilla how she was. Really asking. The same question she had failed to ask him. Two people loving each other at an exhausted remove and calling it management. We're going to see someone, she said. A couples counselor. We talked about it. He agreed. She paused. I think he was almost relieved. Like he'd been waiting for someone to name the problem out loud. I sat with all of it. With the full picture of my daughter's life as it actually was. Not as I had been observing it from the outside during holidays. Not as it had been presented to me in the managed, careful version that adult children present to aging parents. The real life. With its polite loneliness and its surface management, and its two tired people, and its underneath happiness that was still there, still present, still worth the work. I thought about what I had almost missed. About how close I had come to being discharged from the hospital, going to a rehabilitation facility, and never standing in this hallway, never hearing through this wall, never sitting in this guest room and asking my daughter the questions that opened what needed opening. About how a terrible thing had made a necessary thing possible. I looked at Priscilla and I said, I want to tell you something that I haven't said enough. In the way it needs to be said. She waited. Your mother and I made you, I said. And you are the best thing we made. Not because you're capable, though you are, and not because you're strong, though you are. Because you love with everything you have, and you give more than you take, and you stand in gaps for people without announcing it, and you've been doing that your whole life. I stopped. And I have not told you often enough that I see it. That I see what it costs. That I am so proud of you, Priscilla. Not of your accomplishments. Of who you are. Her eyes filled. Your mother saw it, I said. She saw everything in you. She used to tell me. She used to say, that one got all the best of both of us. She was right. Priscilla reached over and put her arms around me the way she had not since her mother's funeral. Fully, carefully because of the surgery, but fully. And I held my daughter in the guest room of her house on a February morning, and I thought about structural load, and what holds, and what gives, and I thought about the fact that the strongest structures are not the rigid ones. They are the ones built with enough give to absorb what comes. She had given. For years. It was time for the people who loved her to give back. That evening, after dinner, the three of us at the kitchen table, a meal Joshua had come home early to cook, a gesture both deliberate and domestic. I said to Joshua, Priscilla told me you're going to see someone together. He nodded, met my eyes. We're overdue. Yes, I said. You are. And I think you're both going to be fine. Not because the problems aren't real. Because I've watched my daughter love you for 7 years, and I've watched you love her back in the ways you know how. And what's between you is worth the work. I paused. I want you to know I believe that. Joshua was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. And it was the most direct, unguarded thing I had heard from him since I arrived. Priscilla looked at her husband and then at her father, and the expression on her face, relief and gratitude and something that was beginning, cautiously, to look like the underneath happiness she had described, was the most like Caroline's face I had ever seen her. We are almost at the end, and I don't want it to be over. Tell me in the comments, what moment in this act broke you open? What did this story make you think about your own family? The 6 weeks became 7. Dr. Hendricks extended my recovery stay by 10 days after a follow-up that revealed the healing was progressing well, but that my blood pressure warranted additional monitoring before he was comfortable clearing me to return to solo living. I told Priscilla when he said it, prepared for some version of the tension that had opened this chapter. She looked at me and said, simply, "Good. The garden's almost ready to start, and I want you here for that." The 10 days were different from the first days. Not because the problems had vanished. Priscilla and Joshua were in the early stages of couples counseling, which meant the house sometimes carried the specific atmosphere of people processing things, the air slightly charged in the way it is when people are doing real interior work. But the charge was different from the compressed, managed tension of that first day. It was productive tension. The tension of a structure being reinforced rather than one straining at its limits. Joshua and I had breakfast together on a Tuesday morning when Priscilla had left early for a school counseling workshop. Just the two of us, which 3 weeks prior would have produced a silence of significant mutual discomfort. We had coffee and eggs and we talked about his work, about the promotion that was still pending, about what he wanted the next chapter of his career to look like once the pressure of this stretch eased. He asked about my bridges. Not politely, genuinely. He asked about the engineering of them, about what had drawn me to structural work, about the projects I was most proud of. I told him about a bridge in western North Carolina, a pedestrian bridge over a gorge outside Asheville, which I had designed early in my career and which was still standing, still carrying people across a distance they couldn't otherwise cross. I told him about the particular satisfaction of work that outlasts you, that continues to hold after you have stopped holding it. He listened, really listened, in the way of a man who has recently been confronted with his own patterns of not quite hearing and has decided to practice the opposite. When I finished, he said, "I'd like to see it sometime. That bridge." "I'll take you," I said. He looked at me. "Yeah. When I'm cleared to drive," I said. "We'll go." He nodded. Something settled in his expression, something that had been slightly elevated since I'd arrived, slightly on guard, finally coming to rest. Renata flew in for the final weekend of my stay. She arrived on a Friday evening with the energy she always brought, filling the doorway the way she filled every room, with her mother's laugh and her own particular force. And she walked through the house with the assessment of a woman who had been monitoring the situation from Denver and was now conducting her own on-site evaluation. She pulled me aside on Saturday morning while Joshua and Priscilla were at their second counseling appointment. We sat on the back porch in the first tentative warmth of what was beginning to feel, at the edges of February, like the possibility of spring. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her. The full version this time. The hallway, the words through the wall, the kitchen conversation, the guest room, the 2 hours of closed-door talking, the apology, the breakfast Tuesday morning. All of it. She listened without interrupting, which required effort from Renata and which she expended. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. Then she said, "He hurt you." "Yes," I said. "And you forgave him." "I'm working on it," I said, which was the most honest answer. "I've forgiven the act. The residue of it takes longer." She nodded. "How's Priscilla?" "Tired," I said. "Getting less tired. She and Joshua are doing the work." I paused. She needed someone to ask her how she was. Really ask. I should have been asking for a long time. Renata looked at me with her mother's eyes. "You're asking now. Late is better than not," I said. "Yeah," she agreed. "It is." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Daddy, I want to say something." "Say it." "When you called me from the guest room that first day and said you were handling it," she stopped. "I want you to know that you don't always have to handle it. You're allowed to need things. Not just need a guest room during recovery. Need emotional things. Support. Someone to sit with you and not require anything from you. You've been doing everything alone since Mama died, and we've let you because you've made it so easy to let you." She looked at me. I don't want to let you anymore. The porch was quiet. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a bird had decided that spring was closer than the calendar said and was making its argument to the available air. Okay, I said. Okay. She looked at me, surprised, a little, at the brevity of my acceptance. I'm 68 years old, and I've had surgery, and I've spent the last 7 weeks learning that asking for help is not what I thought it was, I said. So yes. Okay. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You're something else, old man. Language, I said, and she laughed. Rosalind's laugh, Caroline's laugh, the laugh that runs through the women of this family like a structural element, load-bearing and beautiful. And I laughed too, which pulled slightly at the healing incision, and I didn't mind. On my last morning at the house on Hendersonville, Priscilla made breakfast. A proper one. Eggs and toast and fruit, the kind of meal Caroline used to make on Sunday mornings when everyone was home, when the kitchen had the particular warmth of food and family and nowhere to be urgently. Renata was still there. Joshua had taken the morning off work, a choice so uncharacteristic of his recent patterns that Priscilla had blinked when he announced it, and then smiled. The four of us sat at the kitchen table. I looked around that table, at my daughters, both of them, and at the man my older daughter had married, who was looking at his wife across the table with an attention that had not been present a month ago. A noticing. The kind of looking that says I see you, specifically, and I am not taking what I see for granted. Priscilla caught him looking. She held it for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it was a small gesture and entirely private in its meaning, and I looked away from it, because some moments belong only to the people in them. But I noted it, filed it in the column of things that give a father reason to believe the people he loves are going to be all right. After breakfast, Joshua carried my bag to the car. Not because I couldn't, I was nearly full capacity by then, but because he offered and I let him, which is a small thing and is also not a small thing. He put the bag in the trunk and closed it and turned and looked at me in the morning light of the driveway. Mr. ZAHA, he said. Joshua, I'm glad you were here, he said. I know that is, he paused. I know that given how it started, that's a strange thing to say, but I'm glad. I looked at my son-in-law, at the man my daughter loved, who had said 4 words through a wall that had cut me to the bone, and who had then spent 7 weeks choosing, daily, to be better than those 4 words, who had gone to counseling and come home earlier and cooked dinner and sat across breakfast tables and asked about bridges. Who was glad? So am I said. We shook hands. Then, and I want to record this because it surprised me, because it was not something either of us had planned, he extended the handshake into something briefly, slightly more. The kind of thing men do when they're saying something that handshakes almost cover, but not quite. I drove back to Asheville on a morning when the mountains were beginning, at their edges, to consider spring. The bare trees still bare, but with something suggested in them, the particular tension of things that are about to begin. I thought about Caroline, about what she would say about the 7 weeks. I thought she would say, it took a surgical bag and a drainage tube and 4 words through a wall and 7 weeks of everybody learning something they needed to learn. But you got there, ZAHA. All of you. She would say it with a laugh. She would say it like she'd known all along it would take exactly that much difficulty to produce exactly this result. She had always known what things cost before she paid them and considered the cost fair anyway. I got home. I walked up the front steps of my house in Asheville on legs that were stronger than they'd been in February. I unlocked the door. I went inside, to the house that was mine and quiet and full of the shape of everything I'd built in it. I sat in my chair by the window, and I called Priscilla. She answered on the second ring. You made it. I made it, I said. How are you? She told me. Really told me. Not the managed version. The real one. For 20 minutes, she told me about her day and Joshua's day, and the counseling, and the work, and the small things that were shifting between them, and the places where it was still hard. And I listened. Really listened. The way Caroline had always listened, fully and without agenda, making space rather than filling it. I am Mr. ZAHA. I am 68 years old. I asked to stay with my daughter after surgery, and her husband said 4 words through a wall that I was not supposed to hear. And in the aftermath of those 4 words, in the hallway, in the guest room, at the kitchen table, on the back porch with my younger daughter in the first suggestion of spring, I found more than I had come looking for. I came looking for a safe place to recover. I found it. And I found the truth of my daughter's life as it actually was. And I found the beginning of something real with the man she married. And I found, in the asking and the answering of how are you, really, the conversation that Caroline had always made look effortless, and that I am only now, at 68 years old and 7 weeks post-surgery, beginning to learn. Some structures take longer to build than others. The ones that matter always do. The strongest bridges are not the ones that never face wind. They are the ones built to move with it and remain. If this story reached something in you, if Mr. ZAHA's 7 weeks, Priscilla's quiet exhaustion, or even Joshua's 4 words and everything that followed them moved you or challenged you or made you think about your own family, please leave a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you hardest. Tell me if you've ever been Priscilla, carrying things quietly for everyone else. Tell me if you've ever been Joshua, saying something you couldn't take back. Tell me what this story meant to you. Every single comment keeps these stories alive, and every one of them matters. Thank you for reading every word of this. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.